Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Mitigating Cyber Risks in Digital Medical Devices, an Introduction. I'm Kate Klaus, staff attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, Elliot Turini and Gerard Nussbaum, thank you for joining us. Elliot Turini was a federal cybercrime prosecutor, cyber law and privacy attorney in private practice, and tech company general counsel. He is a cyber risk mitigation expert who founded and runs Practical Cyber, a cyber risk mitigation firm with a medical device specialty. He was a co-editor and author of the book, Cybercrimes, a Multidisciplinary Analysis. Gerard Nussbaum is an experienced strategic advisor and healthcare executive, provides strategic advice and leadership to assist healthcare entities, both provider organizations and suppliers, to address their digital health challenges, define and execute their strategic vision, assure compliance with legal and regulatory requirements, and to actively drive organizational success. Gerard continues to support and work with leading device manufacturers, academic medical centers and health sciences campuses, children's hospitals, health systems, startups, and health industry vendors. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Elliot.
Okay, folks, so it's nice of you all to join us today. We're going to dive right in. I always like starting these with the good old what's in it for you. So today we're going to discuss things about how to mitigate pre-market cyber risks arising from design flaws, engineering flaws, implementation flaws, also from regulatory approval failures and clinical trial impediments. We'll talk about driving revenue by persuading customers and partners that your devices are cyber secure, about how to reduce post-market cybersecurity costs relating to cybersecurity vulnerabilities, reporting, remediation, and recalls. And we'll also talk about managing cyber attacks and PHI data breaches in ways that limit legal liability and regulatory fines. So we're going to start with about 20 minutes to set the stage for the last section of this webinar, which is where we are going to give you guys detailed mitigation advice and suggestions. So we're going to start quickly with the definition of digital medical device. Now, per the FDA's pre-market cybersecurity guidance, a digital medical device is any device containing software, including firmware, or programmable logic, as well as software that is a medical device. In layman's terms, what that means, it's a digital medical device is any device using any form of computer hardware, firmware, or software. I'm now going to run through a few representative examples. It would be any software as service as medical device, such as Kios Medical, which has an AI-based diagnostic software for breast cancer ultrasounds. You'll have things like smart pacemakers, such as Boston Scientific's Essentio MRI Safe Pacemaker. Smart continuous glucose monitors like Eversense or Freestyle Libre. Smart insulin pens like GoCap, InPen, or Astissa. Connected inhalers like the one from Propeller Health. Ingestible sensors like from Proteus Digital Health. Asthma testing like Atom. Those are just some of the ways that that you would qualify as a digital medical device. So now I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Gerard.
Elliot, thank you, and thank you all for being here. And as we go through with this, we're going to try to keep this at a non-uber techie level. There's lots of layers below things, so if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat and during the Q&A session, or reach out to us afterwards. This diagram on your screen is not really news to anybody. We just wanted to, call everyone's attention to the fact that we think that cyber risks and cybersecurity need to be addressed throughout the entire device life cycle, from ideation, the original concept for the thing, and where you're sort of noodling around. And, some examples even at that stage are important. So who are your customers? What's their cyber use environment? What is their cyber sophistication? So even when you're thinking about how, to create a brand new idea, new solution to help move healthcare forward, you have to be thinking about the cyber process throughout that. And then as you go through in the details, the planning, obviously in the designing it in upfront, not trying to add it in later, becomes critically important for successful cyber risk mitigation. And then as you go through validation, obviously including cyber testing, approval, and then once we get to post-market, the whole aspect of surveillance includes monitoring and, remediating defects. And then when you think about retirement, what's become increasingly important with medical devices is realizing when something may be physically still functional but becomes technically obsolete because you can no longer guarantee the cybersecurity of that device. Next slide, please.
Okay. So I'm going to give you guys a quick refresher about the FDA's approach to cybersecurity. The FDA influences device cybersecurity in three main ways. First, in the pre-market approval process, it requires digital device manufacturers to submit documentation in their 510K or PMA applications that explain how they've mitigated cyber risks. Second, in December 2018, the FDA published its pre-market cybersecurity guidance, which includes detailed recommendations, they're not regulations, for the cybersecurity documentation that manufacturers should include in these pre-market submissions. And they include design controls, where you should explain your device cybersecurity. There's security risk management documentation, which is where you should explain your cyber risk assessment behind your cybersecurity decisions, and labeling documentation, which needs to detail the cybersecurity instructions for all your end users. The third way is in 2016, the FDA had published cybersecurity guidance to help manufacturers reduce patient harm from post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Its main recommendations were to create these three interconnected systems. 1, vulnerability monitoring, 2, vulnerability impact and risk assessment, and 3, a remediate and reporting system, which we're going to explain in detail later on. And also, it recommended to participate in an information sharing and analysis organization, and the FDA will give you certain advantages in the reporting process if you do participate actively in an ISO. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Gerard.
So the goals of a digital medical device cybersecurity, share the goals of the overall device. First of all, we're here to, protect patient safety and privacy. Our goal of any device is to improve diagnostic and treatment, improve outcomes, and clearly we have to get cybersecurity in that harness to make sure that we're protecting the patient's safety and privacy. Customers, and oftentimes you're selling to a healthcare provider organization or provider, as well as to the end user, they have expectations for cybersecurity. And as you think about the device and its, initiation, the ideation, the design, and through your post-market interactions with them, you have an opportunity not only to identify what their expectations are, perhaps shape them through appropriate dialogues and interactions, as well as through obviously the contract, and then make sure you set about exceeding their expectations. One of the things about expectations in the cybersecurity realm is they keep increasing as we experience things that we previously didn't, anticipate being a problem. I'm talking about healthcare cybersecurity, not the broader world. But people's expectations change. So it's not like, well, we have an expectation, we code it in, we put it in the design, and all's good. That thing shifts over time, and part of the expectation management there is interacting with your customers about the cybersecurity. And then clearly, if we're going to remain in business as manufacturers and providers of key healthcare equipment, avoiding the financial loss from device cybersecurity risks. Next slide, please. And so, here you have to understand where your potential areas where you're going to have costs or risks. Clearly, regulatory approval. Most of the devices we're talking about require 510K, PMA applications. Clinical trials is an opportunity where you get to bang up against customer expectations, even if they are to some extent partnering with you. In the argot of the way the FDA looks at these things, they term them guidance. Yeah, that's a legal fiction, I think, in some respects, because that's the FDA's position on things. And if you don't meet their cybersecurity expectations, and most importantly, the documentation, which we'll talk about more, they'll reject your application. They'll kick it back to you because of deficient cybersecurity documentation. That's not only the product, but the processes that go around it. And clearly, anytime you set out to do something in a regulatory environment and you take extra cycles, well, clearly that costs money, it's time-consuming, it's expensive. But more importantly, as we look at these things, any delay you have in getting your product to market doesn't just chew up my, research budget or my development budget for new products. It cuts into my market, time on market, and hitting the market before my competitors do with new features and functions. And cybersecurity, while not the primary function of the device, can become a key feature. And the bottom line is, well, if you don't address cybersecurity holistically throughout the process, this will cost you money in terms of your resources, market time, and your ability to have a competitive advantage. Next slide, please.
Okay, so another big risk is this concept that you have to prepare for clinical trials and sales by anticipating the cybersecurity expectations of your potential clinical trial partners and customers. So what happens is your clinical trial partners, potential customers, all these health delivery organizations, they're getting more sophisticated in how they look at the devices. They're realizing there are these significant shared cyber risks that could lead to significant legal and regulatory liability. So what they're doing is they're vigilantly evaluating the medical devices before they agree to a clinical trial or before they agree to buy. And if you're not familiar with the MDS-2, that's one of the documents. It's 160 questions that your healthcare delivery organizations might have you fill out. Some will even have you ask you to show things like a high trust certification. So what you need to do is anticipate and do the research ahead of time on what your potential clinical trial partners and customers are going to want from you. Because if you're not prepared to prove your cybersecurity, it can be very difficult to negotiate and get a trial and to make sales. So the bottom line is, early on, understand the types of cybersecurity controls and processes that they're going to want from you. And then build into your device lifecycle the time, money, and expertise that you're going to need to accomplish this. So the next topic here is addressing unexploited cybersecurity vulnerabilities. As I stated earlier, the FDA's post-market cybersecurity guidance recommends that manufacturers create these three different systems: vulnerability monitoring, vulnerability impact and risk assessment, and vulnerability remediation and reporting. We have this nice infographic that helps you understand how this all fits together. As to the remediation and reporting concept is, you might have to report and remediate unexploited vulnerabilities. This can lead to high costs for reporting, remediation, even recalls, and it could even lead to regulatory fines. And in the last part of this webinar, we're going to offer advice about how to mitigate these costs. So Gerard?
Yeah, I think one of the things as you're looking at exploited and even unexploited cybersecurity vulnerabilities is what's the patient injury. And clearly, if you have an exploited cybersecurity vulnerability, there's a potential that that defect, because it allows an attack on the device, it allows someone to control the device remotely or perhaps interfere with its functionality, you could cause injury to a patient. And you'll have fairly high cost, obviously, the minute we get into injury to property, death, injury to persons, you're looking at fairly high costs, both in terms of the direct malpractice-related claims and product liability claims, but also you look at harm due to your position in the marketplace. It's similarly with the unexploited side, even in something that's not exploited, can lead to patient psychological harm if they're fearful for their device, or it leads to cautious behavior, especially with someone saying, well, we may need to remove implants or things like that. So the injury to patients is a very key thing. Another form of exploitation is the data breach itself, which can lead to the loss of information and can also, in the same similar sense, your device may be exploited, the patient may not be harmed, but the exploitation of the device allows someone to steal your intellectual property. So you can also impair relationships with customers, either through the direct breach or the data breach, where people say, well, I have other business harm. It's not just related to the patient harm that was suffered. And then, of course, clearly you're in hot water with the regulators. As an aside, you can even create in terms of your financial reporting under the SEC, because you're juggling all these balls trying to deal with a potentially exploited risk or vulnerability in your product. You don't want to go public too soon before you have a solution in place, but then you have to look at your financial services industries and SEC reporting issues. Next slide, please. And then, as we look at the declension of digital device vulnerabilities, it really comes down to they can happen in one of several phases: software vulnerabilities, hardware and firmware, and we'll talk a little bit more about the distinctions here, but also the improper system integration, implementation, monitoring. There are lots of examples across all types of software, including medical devices and medical software and EHRs, where a really good product was implemented poorly, and that could be the manufacturer's issue, it could be the customer's issue, or was improperly maintained, and you lead to a vulnerability and exploitation. Next slide, please.
All right, so folks, I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you an overview of the different types of vulnerabilities. Let's begin with software. A software vulnerability is defined as a flaw or weakness in software that could be accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited to interfere with a software's performance and or facilitate unauthorized control over the computer system running the software. The most prevalent types here are listed on the screen. I am not going to go into detail. And for those people in the audience who are on the more technical side of this, you can absolutely contact us and contact me. I'll be happy to give you more information as to these types of software vulnerabilities. Okay, so let's just talk about your regulatory and legal responsibilities for software vulnerabilities. You are responsible for all vulnerabilities in software that you create yourself. If you license it, you use it. To be clear, that means if you license software or use software that contains any vulnerability, you will be liable for any harm that vulnerability causes from both regulatory and legal perspectives. This means that your software vulnerability runs throughout the entire device lifecycle, right, including an affirmative obligation, regulatory obligation for the post-market cybersecurity vulnerability monitoring, remediation, and reporting. Now, here's also a quick list of secure coding best practices. We're not going to go into in today's webinar, but you can contact me for more information. All right, I want to just talk briefly about this concept of ensuring the integrity, authenticity, and confidentiality of software upgrades and patches. So almost all software requires upgrades and patches. Now, the upgrade and patching process needs to be properly secured because it has been a popular vehicle for malicious attack. For those not familiar, in 2017, the NotPetya worm hit many large companies and small companies around the world. You may have heard how it almost took down Merck, and literally Merck reported $1 billion in losses from the NotPetya worm. The shipping giant Maersk reported about $600 million. And the way the NotPetya worm got started is the attackers were able to hack into the computing system of a Ukrainian accounting software company. And they co-opted the upgrade component of that service. And they were then, the next upgrade went out and it included the worm. And hence, this is an example of how you need to use the right cybersecurity to prevent someone from getting into your upgrade and patching process. Now, there's one company that I've worked with before, Medmarc, which has a service that does this. And you could do it on your own, but it gets complex because you got to use the right encryption. And then I'm going to end the software vulnerability section. I'm going to tell you an example that is worth understanding. All right, and this is the IPNet example. So there, a security firm identified 11 vulnerabilities in IPNet, which is a third-party software component that various medical device manufacturers were using for network communications among computers. Now, on October 1st, 2019, the FDA issued a safety communication informing patients, healthcare providers, and facility staff and manufacturers about these 11 vulnerabilities that may allow anyone to take remote control of the medical device, change its function, cause a denial of service, or cause information leaks or logic flaws. And then the FDA gave a litany of recommendations to manufacturers and healthcare delivery organizations. Conduct a risk assessment, work with your operating system vendor to identify and implement a patch, develop a plan for updating your devices with an OS not affected by these vulnerabilities. Collaborate with all of the people in your ecosystem to identify the affected devices and develop a remediation plan, reduce the risks, and on and on. Now, the bottom line here was many manufacturers bought this third-party software. It was a good price, but then, lo and behold, the long-term true costs were much, much higher because the use of this software caused these manufacturers, cost them a lot of money post-market with reporting and remediation. So I'm now going to turn to hardware vulnerabilities. So a hardware vulnerability, just as a definition, they are an exploitable weakness in the hardware components of a computer system that could be accidentally triggered or intentionally exploited to facilitate unauthorized control over the computer system. Here's a brief summary of the difference among hardware, firmware, and software. So when I say hardware, I'm talking about the tangible physical components like a CPU or RAM. Firmware is a special kind of software that's semi-permanently installed on the hardware itself to help the hardware function. And you can often change the firmware with a special process. Now, obviously, software is a broad term for the programming running on hardware. Familiar kinds are operating systems, which control the overall computer hardware and applications. And then you have the applications themselves, which you're going to have sometimes customized applications that you create for your own devices. So the last part of this slide are different types of hardware vulnerabilities for which I'm not going to detail. Again, you could contact me to learn more about them if you are on the technical side. So I'm going to quickly go into an example of a hardware vulnerability. Meltdown and Spectre are hardware attacks that exploited hardware vulnerabilities. So they are both what's called a cache-side channel attack. So it was in 2017 that Google's Project Zero identified both of these attacks. And what they do is they take advantage of an ability to extract information from instructions that have been executed on a CPU. Now, the impact is they enabled the attackers to steal data that's stored in the memory of other running programs, like passwords stored in a password manager or browser. You can even steal things like personal photos, emails, instant messages, and even business-critical documents. So on January 2nd, 2018, the U.S. CERT issued an alert that went out to everybody, particularly healthcare delivery organizations and medical device manufacturers. And here's just some of the device manufacturers who were using CPOs that had the vulnerability: Abbott, BD, GE, Honeywell, J&J, Medtronic, OSI, Soft, Traeger, Philips, Siemens, Beckman Coulter, Emerson, Rockwell. And the bottom line here is that millions of computers had to be patched at significant costs. And one of the patches even degraded CPU performance, which is a potentially huge problem for those digital medical devices that require speed for their safety. Okay. And the last section here in vulnerabilities is this concept of improper system integration, implementation, monitoring, and/or end user error. So you must understand that once commercialized, your devices will generate shared cyber risks with healthcare delivery organizations that are deploying your devices. And with this shared risk, there is joint and several liability for harm caused by cybersecurity failures. So an example of a system integrations issue is when medical devices software was installed on a cardiology workstation that supported a cardiac procedure, the software came with specially configured antivirus software. But when implemented, the hospital IT staff reconfigured the antivirus software to meet its own internal specifications, and that reconfiguration impeded the software performance. So what you would do in that instance is, to prevent that from happening, you have to have very clear labeling and instructions of use, and then you got to make sure that the healthcare delivery organization is actually following it. Because in this situation, you're going to have post-market reporting and remediation costs, even though it was the fault of the healthcare delivery organization. And then as an example of an end user issue, you have user authentication failure, i.e. a failure to require user authentication for critical functions and other authentication vulnerabilities, and that can leave devices susceptible to attack. And one common example is the use of hard-coded user credentials used across the fleet of devices. And for this, quickly, some important mitigations. Your cybersecurity strategy should mitigate these shared risks via proper labeling and instructions of use, good end-user training, and contracts that shift these risks to healthcare delivery organizations. Move on. So now we're at the what I'm going to call the meat and potatoes of our presentation. Here's a list of the 5 topics for which we will give detailed mitigation advice and suggestions. And Gerard is going to start with the first topic, cybersecurity governance matters.
So when an organization, and I'm speaking, for example, of a health system, goes to acquire, a system, it involves a multidisciplinary team. And similarly, on your side, you need to be looking at, from the manufacturer's side, how do you quantify all operational device security risks? And how do you, realize that resources are not unlimited, try to, deploy them appropriately so they mitigate? So we've got, a range of areas here. I'm going to talk specifically about the leadership and governance structure, but, there's cybersecurity issues, there's computing continuity, there's risk transfer via contract, insurance, and instruction labeling, and then there's secure partners. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, I'll start out talking about the, leadership issue. As you look at the whole issue here of the role of leadership, and that goes from your board on down, it's what are our structures, what are my incentives, what are my control processes over this whole thing. Next slide, please. And so, as you look at this life cycle, you really need to focus on, making sure you've got the leadership and the governance throughout the entire life cycle. And oftentimes, especially in device companies that have multiple product lines, we can't have, each product line going out and trying to explore its own cybersecurity, terrain. It really helps to come across with corporate guidelines created in the context of the, product lines, but also in terms of the overall process by which you maintain cybersecurity. Next slide, please. And so looking at this, it starts from the top. The board of directors to exercise duty as a board to look at the overall risk of the organization. They really have to be educated on cybersecurity risks, the amount of potential loss and money at stake, both in terms of avoiding the problems as well as what you're trying to avoid, which is an adverse event that costs your organization lots of money. And also, you really have to get them on board with investing the resources up front to include cybersecurity into this process. Also, it's really important to make sure you have the right team in place across this. That includes not only the operational, the product line folks, but the cost, the financial, legal, and technical, and really look at this from the standpoint of, how do we bring the best to bear and keep all stakeholders, because they all have different perspectives on these things. A product line manager who's, shepherding through a new product has one primary objective, which is get that product on the market and making money. And different perspectives from legal or compliance area may say, well, yeah, we're all on board with getting it done. We have to do it in the right order, as we talked about before, making sure that we've got all the FDA documentation done so we don't end up with redos and the like. Next slide, please. I think one of the issues here is how you look at cybersecurity leadership. And, in many cases, and this, is a scale factor for the organization, but I think it's really important for there to be a product line focus on cybersecurity. And I, not to suggest we create another C-level office, but there really needs to be a chief cybersecurity officer for the product line area who can really focus on how we can drive security through our products that we create, design, deliver, and provide to end customers and then maintain. And that really allows them to have focus. What I've seen in places is that if you put this under the corporate CISO, your pronunciation may vary, the Chief Information Security Officer, their primary focus oftentimes is operational. How do I protect the corporation's computing assets? And therefore, the product, there's a lot of tension with the product line people because they don't feel they're getting enough focus and time. So by having that dedicated product line cybersecurity leader at whatever level, who works very closely with the corporate security environment and creating standards and principles and best practices, you can balance out the needs for the product line advancement as well as maintain the security organization. And this interdigitates back into the organization's risk and compliance area, its regulatory compliance, its overall risk and legal compliance management processes. And then the question is, depending on the size of the organization, some organizations may not be able to deploy this full range of talent. And so therefore, the opportunity to outsource a part-time CISO or part-time device security leader is an opportunity for a growing organization to pull in as much resources as they want, leveraging outside folks or having full-time folks. And as we look at these product line people, they're people who are tuned and understand the product line process, but also understand the cybersecurity processes and the like. Another key aspect of the cybersecurity product line leader is they have to have the ability to throw a flag and stop play. Giving them, to some extent, an ability to, in a Toyota Kaizen mode, to pull that lever and say, stop, we're going down the wrong category. And then the governance processes to sort of arbitrate that discussion. Next slide, I'll turn over to Elliot.
I want to add something quickly to this topic, is to highlight the need for this multidisciplinary expertise that Gerard touched upon. As you can tell from what we've been talking about, you need a great lawyer. You need someone who understands the economics and can do the Excel spreadsheets from a financial perspective. You have to have someone who understands the risks, someone who understands all of the compliance regulations and recommendations. So it gets complex. So one of the things, it's kind of hard to just ask a typical CISO to be able to do all this. So that's another reason why you want to have someone who's a product line expert. And also what we found is, my company itself, we basically our most exciting opportunities with clients is to act as that joint CISO and product line cybersecurity expert. So if you're interested in that, you should definitely contact us. But let's move on. I'm going to do a really important topic. This is our second big advice, which is conduct a proper system-wide full lifecycle threat and risk analysis. Okay, per the FDA's premarket cybersecurity guidance and also per secure software coding and IoT device design best practices, whenever you're designing a digital medical device, you should start with a system-wide full device lifecycle threat and risk analysis. Now, specifically, the FDA's pre-market cybersecurity guidance recommends that your pre-market submissions include a list of the specific cybersecurity risks that you considered during the design phase. And if you don't have a good list, they can ding you and slow you down in terms of approval. Now, to conduct a proper analysis, the ideation part of your device life cycle needs to have enough detail. Otherwise, you'll miss too many threats and risks. And your analysis must consider the full product life cycle and risk associated with all of your device's interactions with all end users. And end users could be healthcare practitioners, it could be the IT staff in a healthcare delivery organization, and it can be the patients themselves. All right. Now, sufficient detail means specifying the basic components and their functions for the full device life cycle, which you should be doing per the FDA's pre-market cybersecurity guidance. And it particularly recommends that you create what's called a system diagram and a cybersecurity bill of materials. Now, the cybersecurity bill of materials, what we're finding out is that in the next draft of the pre-market cybersecurity guidance, they're going to call it a software bill of materials. I recommend not taking that shortcut because with your device, when you're doing post-market vulnerabilities and you're trying to reduce all those post-market costs, you need to track all the components, hardware, firmware, and software. So you always want to have this full cybersecurity bill of materials for every single component, hardware, firmware, software in your device and the related systems. So now, as a bottom line is, your system-wide threat and risk analysis should guide the design, the engineering, and the post-market implementation and maintenance of your entire device system. Now, it's also expensive and difficult to do a really good system-wide, full life cycle threat and risk analysis. And sometimes younger medical device manufacturers can benefit from engaging external expertise to help with the threat and risk analysis, but also the same experts can help with cybersecurity design controls and also the cybersecurity engineering. Now we're going to move to this concept of good design, smart engineering, and proper labeling. So at the FDA approval, the FDA's pre-market guidance recommends explaining how your device uses a long list of design controls. And it divides that list into two categories: identify and protect device assets and functionality, and detect, respond, and recover. Now, we won't list all the sub-items in each category, but I want to emphasize that at a minimum, in your design control documentation and pre-market submissions, you scrutinize how your device cybersecurity strategy addresses each item in the FDA's detailed list of design control options. Now I want to talk a little bit about how design controls can save you money in the long run. So vulnerabilities in your device can lead to huge post-market costs, such as legal liability for patient harm, and even just high costs for unexploited vulnerabilities from just the post-market remediation and reporting requirements. Now, the technological aspects of remediating vulnerabilities after commercialization can actually be much more expensive in the long run than just taking the right pre-market cybersecurity precautions. A quick note about quantifying threats and risks. So quantifying and prioritizing that specific list of threats and risks that you considered in your system-wide threat and risk analysis will help you intelligently allocate your limited cybersecurity resources to all the aspects of design, engineering, and implementation so that you will best mitigate the overall costs from cyber risks. Unfortunately, but quantifying a system-wide threat and risk analysis requires significant cyber threat and financial expertise. And that's another instance where younger medical device manufacturers, in fact, even mature medical device manufacturers, have a tough time with the quantification and prioritization. So now I'm going to switch to engineering cybersecurity issues. So engineering it's the part of your device lifecycle where you build, test, and validate your device. So from a cybersecurity perspective, it includes these main parts: buying or building trustworthy hardware components, licensing, coding, or procuring trustworthy software such as operating systems into device analysis systems, and then integrating and testing and validating your components. So here are some tips to consider. As to hardware, you've got to know that hardware components have different cybersecurity issues. So you can look at 5 different CPUs, and you may want to pick the cheapest one, but that might not necessarily be the cheapest from a long-term cost perspective. You're going to need to assess the cybersecurity of every hardware component that you include in your device system. Software. Most device vulnerabilities have come from software, and it is not easy to create secure software, and it gets even harder to assess the security of software that you're going to procure. And you got to remember that failure in this instance can be very costly in the long run. The third and final concept here is strong quality management. Now, this involves ample testing and validation after device integration, and that includes all possible interactions with your end users. A strong quality management process also includes ensuring that your device was properly manufactured, integrated, and implemented. And doing this well can save you tons of post-market costs. All right, so let's talk about cybersecurity labeling and instructions of use. So they are all documentation and or training that you will have to help all end users, whether it's healthcare practitioners, healthcare support staff, or patients, avoid actions that will add some form of cybersecurity vulnerability that increases the risk of patient harm. So as to compliance, you got to remember that proper labeling and instructions of use begin with following the FDA's cybersecurity guidance, pre-market cybersecurity guidance, and that includes a list of issues to consider when doing your labeling. So we recommend that you start by using that checklist when you're creating your labeling and instructions of use documentation. And remember to include that documentation in your pre-market submissions like the 510K or the PMA. And here are a few economic considerations. You might be able to reuse clear, effective, and end-user labeling and instructions of use to reduce your customer service and or technological support costs. Now, they might also facilitate sales because some healthcare delivery organizations prefer to buy devices that require little configuration and or implementation effort by them. And if you have clear, effective end-user labeling and instructions of use, and a vulnerability is then introduced by an end user, and that vulnerability contravenes your labeling and instructions of use, you can leverage that fact to mitigate potential regulatory and or legal liability and related costs if that introduced vulnerability goes on to cause patient harm. And here's a tip. After you do all this stuff, remember to talk with the lawyers and make sure that your agreements and SLAs memorialize all your decisions that are made in this area. So now let's go to post-market implementation challenges. What I like to say here is ignorance can hurt you a lot. So per the FDA's post-market cybersecurity guidance, you must diligently and proactively search for cybersecurity vulnerabilities from these 3 sources: customers, internal operations, and expert/external sources. As to customer sources, consider developing good relationships with the cybersecurity personnel at your customer healthcare delivery organizations. These people can be a good source of valuable information about cybersecurity issues and about other aspects of end user satisfaction. Some manufacturers actually create vulnerability reporting functions on their websites to facilitate customer reporting. As to external sources, the FDA's post-market guidance recommends using the CVSS. If you're not familiar with that, you can contact me. I'll explain more about it. You can also consider taking extra steps by monitoring the dark web and proactively developing relationships with some of the key medical device cybersecurity researchers who then might be inclined to give you advance notice about a vulnerability that affects your devices. ISAL participation. It's almost always a good idea to actively participate in an information sharing and analysis organization known as an ISAL because they are a good source of information about cybersecurity design controls, vulnerabilities, and other issues. Plus, the FDA's post-market guidance states that the FDA will give manufacturers that actively participate in ISALs certain post-market reporting advantages. And finally, like harm from failure to identify vulnerabilities. Failure to identify post-market vulnerabilities that you should have known about can lead to an increased probability of an exploited vulnerability that injures patients and can cause almost unlimited legal liability, and increased exposure to regulatory liability even for unexploited vulnerabilities, and negative press that hurts your ability to raise money and or make future sales. So let's talk a little bit about post-market remediation and reporting. The FDA's post-market cybersecurity guidance recommends that you create systems for 1, assessing the impact and risk assessments of cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and 2, remediating and reporting significant vulnerabilities, which the FDA labels uncontrolled risks, right? Both of these systems should be memorialized with documents that are incorporated into your quality management system. Let's talk about the impact and risk assessment system. This system is used to assess each vulnerability's risk and impact by considering a combination of its exploitability, meaning the ability that someone or the probability that someone will exploit it. And then the second element of your analysis is the risk of patient harm if exploited. This chart is taken directly from the FDA's cybersecurity guidance. And in the guidance, they recommend different ways for you to conduct this analysis. But you will need to have a system written. There are spreadsheets you can use. There are some software that companies will help you if you want to spend money on it. And this is some of our expertise. If you need information here, you can contact me. I'm going to keep going. Let's just talk a little bit about the remediation and reporting system. This is the system to determine how to remediate an uncontrolled vulnerability and or report to the FDA, your customers, and community. Remediation and reporting decisions depend predominantly on the results of your impact and risk assessment for a specific vulnerability. Now, these decisions are complex and can greatly influence your post-market costs. This is where you need to apply that multidisciplinary team, and you have to make sure that some of the team members not only have good relationship with the FDA, but they understand the impact on your overall profitability of how you're going to remediate and report. And I'm going to close this section by talking a little bit about this concept of a robust cyber incident mitigation system. The FDA's guidances don't specify that you need this in so many words, but this is an essential component of an overall mitigation strategy. Some people refer to this traditionally as a cyber incident response plan. I will warn everyone that if you have a check-the-box cyber incident response plan that's like a law firm drafted for you a year ago, 2 years ago, it is almost, I'll give you a money-back guarantee that it is definitely not what you need. I've reviewed so many of those, and we now have a much better approach to creating, and this infographic explains the elements of this. And ideally, you're going to have, as a device manufacturer, this cyber incident mitigation system that covers both operational incidents and device incidents, because you can't really separate the two always, because unfortunately, when you step back and you look at how you do your device cybersecurity and your device function, there's almost always a connection to your operational computing systems. And whenever two computing systems are connected, then you have the metaphor of the weakest link in a chain. So we strongly recommend that when you do your full mitigation efforts, you have this type of cyber incident mitigation system that covers both operational and device risks, and it leverages your full multidisciplinary team, and you have to, one, you have to practice, and you have to ensure that this system can react immediately. And if it's done well, one of the things you may have, like for example, cyber liability insurance or product liability insurance, and you need to have the insurance included into this system because it may cover some of the costs that you have of just getting your team up and running and doing your initial investigation. You may have to have hired ahead of time a cyber forensics investigation firm, and if you're going to rely on your insurance to pay that firm, you better make sure that you've got one of the firms that are approved by your insurance company. So there's so many different issues that go into this cyber incident mitigation system that I wanted to at least highlight it for everyone here, and you can contact me with questions about it. So now I'm going to turn it over to Gerard to talk about the overall use of insurance.
Yeah, so insurance is a key part of your overall risk mitigation and management process, as Elliot has suggested. And there are a variety of potential coverages that you might look at in the cyber context. Clearly, I mean, the first stop for a product that has patient contact, may introduce patient harm, is obviously your product liability coverage. But you can also look at your professional liability, errors and omissions, specific cyber policies. The cyber market is evolving, and these policies are becoming a bit more standardized, along with data breach. While the FDA does not focus at all on data breach in terms of a HIPAA context, clearly if you're collecting patient information or having anything to do with it, the potential for a HIPAA-related data breach exists, as well as a data breach that might compromise care in another way or compromise your trade secrets and intellectual property. Clearly, if there's a significant interruption, I mean, Elliot spoke briefly about the NotPetya that basically shut down the shipping industry, Merck, and a number of healthcare delivery organizations. Clearly, business interruption insurance becomes a part of that process. And then we get into general liability and umbrella. And I think part of the issue here is that as you look at any given product in this very cyber-connected area, was working with a device company who added some features that involved cloud-based reporting and things like that. Well, the cloud-based reporting was sitting, as part of their corporate systems. So when they went and had an issue, it wasn't just a product line issue. It was, how did we focus on this from a corporate issue, because the breach happened at a corporate level, not necessarily within the product envelope. So you need to sort of look at this in terms of thinking about your insurance coverages. The other challenge here is that these coverages interact and may cover certain parts, and depending on how you characterize a given incident, it may pull in different parts of your coverages. And for most organizations, it's not like they're dealing with one insurance company, one carrier. They're looking at policies that may be drawn from a variety of carriers because of the portfolio that a given insurer offers, as well as how it interdigitates and it relates to other coverages. And so looking at that in terms of across your portfolio of insurance coverage is important. Understand to look out for riders and exclusions that may negate or reduce coverage, and the whole challenge of third-party beneficiaries in this process, where especially as you look at the interaction of your own firm's coverages, the whole issue of, okay, so how do I think about third-party liability? Not my customer, perhaps the patient, even though I sold the product to a customer. So you need to bear this in mind in working through your insurance needs. Oftentimes, you'll find that, especially on the cyber side, insurers have a very detailed process and approach for how they look at the assessing the cyber risks. And this may even include, questionnaires that you need to fill out about your cyber environment that, can end up being representations in addition to feeding into their cyber assessment process. Some of the leading insurers also have fairly robust processes where they engage with customers, akin to something that you might traditionally see in terms of a general property casualty liability. They're engaging with their customers to try to reduce the cause of the risk, because obviously insurer benefits and the insured benefits not only for better coverage, but potentially reduced costs. So looking at those things in terms of the representations you're making, and also when those representations may have been true at the time, but now have drifted out of alignment. I've seen this specifically in cases where, we did it at the beginning of the year, come June or August, we introduce a new product, it finally goes live, it alters our cybersecurity risk environment, and we need to go back to those questionnaires, go back to those insurers and say, we introduced this whole new product that may have different features. So looking at those. And then you get to the contractual indemnifications and coverage collisions. That's both, your coverages, but also how that interacts with the coverages of your customers, especially as we look at patient harm issues and the like, and the indemnifications that may be in agreements. One of the other interesting challenges is that, Elliot talked about labeling and using that as a basis to set certain parameters. Your customers, especially larger health systems and other entities, may have very specific cyber policies, and as part of the negotiation of the contract, you may end up with discussions about whose cyber policies govern what you have to do, whose antivirus system works. And if you have the antivirus system be on your side and it's sort of a turnkey system, then you may be accepting different liability and risk than if you put that onus onto the customer. And then looking at the coverages of other parties, could be your suppliers. I mean, if they give you a bad subcomponent, how does their insurance interact with your insurance to cover that? Sufficiency, applicability, ability to access those, especially as it relates to primary versus third-party beneficiaries. And then the whole issue of your customers. And, fundamentally, insurance is a very helpful thing. And at some point, every insurance policy comes with a certain set of what I'll label deductibles or coverage limits. And if your supplier is a small supplier and can't manage to make that first tier before their insurance coverage kicks in, you may not be made whole by the insurance coverage that we have there. And so, excuse me. And, finally, to look at the coordination of incident response and insurers' preferred cyber incident response vendors, especially where you've got multiple parties in the mix, who gets primacy, who controls the investigation, who controls the forensic analysis and decision-making, as well as looking at some of the timelines that may be applicable if there's a data breach under federal and state laws with respect to notification. You really need to look at this coordination. You need to look at it up front as part of your planning, not when you have had an incident. And with that, I want to thank you all for listening to us. We have some time for questions and answers, and I'll turn it over to the wonderful Medmarc people to enlighten us as to the process. And if you have questions after this and we don't get to them or you want to follow up, our contact information is on the screen and will be in the slides.
Thank you both so much. That is a lot of information, and I'm sure it will be very helpful to our audience. We do have a few questions for you. First, what are the key considerations when one is designing connected devices? What are the things they need to keep in mind with regard to cybersecurity?
Well, I'll quickly say that one of the best ways to approach that challenge.
Elliot, are you there?
Yes. Am I not? Someone can't hear me? Can you guys hear me now?
No, that's better. Thank you, Elliot.
Sorry, folks. One of the best ways to approach that challenge is use the FDA's pre-market cybersecurity design control checklist. Go through it. Ask yourself, have I done this? Have I done that? Have I done this? Because there's so many different elements to how you can do connectivity. And there are so many different ways that you can use encryption and monitoring security controls to safeguard the system. So there's no one size fits all, but that checklist is a great way to get you started. And if you don't have someone who's an expert in digital device cybersecurity design, that's where you call in a third party, because there's just so many different options about how you can go about it, and you can waste a lot of money on the wrong design controls.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk a bit about the differences that exist between FDA's guidance on cybersecurity and the EU's medical device regulation?
Gerard, I'll just take that because for the last 3 months, that's something that my company and I've been doing. So there's a lot of money that can be made in selling devices around the world. Now you have, in the EU, you have the medical device regulation that is now take full effect in May. If you haven't read through it, there's a recent 2019 guidance that can help you. But the bottom line is this. The core cybersecurity components that you will need in the United States are the same that you'll need around the world. The challenge will be satisfying what regulators around the world want to see in any type of approval process. Like in the EU, you have the CE mark approval process, and in it, you're going to need some documentation, for all your security risk management of all aspects of the device, which are going to include cybersecurity. So a smart approach is understanding the minute differences from a regulatory perspective, and then taking the core strong cybersecurity designs, your implementation, your post-market stuff, and explaining it in a way that each regulatory entity around the world can understand, and you have slight changes in terminology. So that's how we've been approaching this, so that when we help a company that knows it's going to sell its device around the world, from the beginning, we make sure that everything we do is going to help across different regulatory areas and countries. Go ahead.
And I would add that there is a sort of, I'll put it, next to the regulatory requirements, which try to cover, in the general sense, the things that the regulators are interested in. In all cases, what the regulators are looking for is a floor on what your best practices are from cybersecurity. So part of this is driving to make sure, as Elliot's clearly articulated, the need to meet the regulatory requirements, but also from a fundamental level, are you implementing good cybersecurity? And then a lot of the regulatory issue comes, as Elliot mentioned, in documenting it using the right terminology. But a defense of saying, well, I did everything the regulators asked me, if you've had an exploited vulnerability and you missed something that might be called a best practice in your industry, that's not a defense that I simply checked the list that the regulators gave me. You've got to have this as part of a broad, holistic cybersecurity approach.
I agree. One of the things that is also helpful to do is you'll see some device manufacturers will create cybersecurity white papers. And those white papers will explain, they'll include your system diagram, but then they'll explain all the cybersecurity design controls and engineering and implementation controls that you have used. And if you do a good system diagram with a good white paper, it makes it much easier to prove to any regulator that you've taken reasonable precautions. But it also makes it much easier for clinical trial partners and potential customers like hospital systems.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, and it's a two-parter. I think both of these questions relate to structuring an organization for cybersecurity success. So in the first question, they mention one of the descriptions of multidisciplinary teams. And they noted a difference between cybersecurity and computing continuity. Could you discuss that a bit?
Yeah. So when you're talking about mitigating the overall cyber risks of any organization, we had on this, I'll put on the screen again those 5 tools. Give me 1 second. On the screen are the 5 tools: leadership, structure, incentives, cybersecurity, computing continuity, risk transfer, so forth. So cybersecurity are the classic processes, technology, and people that you would use to mitigate your cyber risks, like informational and device and you're trying to protect your digital assets and your computing assets from things like ransomware or hackers that are kind of come in and steal information or delete information. Contrast that with what happens if you do get hit with a ransomware attack, which are now becoming very prevalent. And as a quick tangent, because insurers are approving payments and companies are paying the ransom, the cyber criminals are going to continue to become more sophisticated in their ransomware attacks because they will go where the money is. So computing continuity means your ability to recreate and restore all of your computing operations. And it is particularly helpful to combat ransomware attacks because you can invest in a system where if there's a ransomware attack, instead of paying the ransom or trying to decrypt how they've encrypted your hardware or your software or your data, what you do is you recreate your entire computing system with clean operating systems, clean applications, and clean data. And if you do that well, you can recreate everything in a day. And then you become almost immune to ransomware attacks. So that's the concept of computing continuity.
Okay, and then in the same vein, can issues arise from having one CISO in charge of both operational cybersecurity and device cybersecurity?
Gerard, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I think part of it is both a question of attention. A corporate CISO or CISO is going to focus on operational issues and things like that, whereas the product line person is really going to be laser focused on being part of that product line team and driving the product forward. And so their attention is on the products. It's not diluted by looking at other things. Also, I think, while they share a very similar skill set, a product line cyber leader is going to really understand that product line process and understand the process of ideation through the concept design and the post-market process. So it's both a question of attention and where they play their focus. I will tell you, having been the CIO of a number of healthcare organizations, it's not about technology, it's about going to meetings. And to some extent, by dividing that focus and allowing the product line cybersecurity leader to really have that focus means that they can be more effective. But at the same time, these two individuals work together closely. So it's about the attention, it's about, to some extent, the expertise and the ability to embed themselves in the product line team.
And I will add that there's also a lot of specific information that you need for device cybersecurity. So let's just focus a second on hardware procurement or software development. In both areas, your typical CISO is not going to have the expertise needed to help you choose among 5 different CPUs, or they're not going to have the expertise to help you vet how a particular third-party software is from a cybersecurity perspective. So this is in part what my company does is we combine both operational cyber risk mitigation and device cyber risk mitigation, but we help apply it, we help do it from a multidisciplinary standpoint. It's just, it gets complex and it can get expensive if you're not, one of the larger medical device manufacturers who can have a full-time, device cybersecurity expert, also a full-time operational cybersecurity expert, and then have like a full-time lawyer like Gerard, who has all this wonderful legal expertise, but also has all experience, from a technological perspective. So it's a tough challenge.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much. This was really great information and very timely for our audience. And I know that this presentation will be very valuable to them going forward. Thank you for joining us. This concludes today's webinar.